This is an unusual video where we're going to cover our travel exploits, almost like a travel vlog, something that I'm sure you're just dying to watch. We're going to talk about our trip to Hawaii and what we drove, what it's like to go on some of these trips, and a little bit more.
So Mark, we were picked out of a pool of journalists to go to Hawaii to drive Porsche's heritage fleet of convertibles. We drove everything from their new cars, like the new 911 Turbo, to the new Carrera S, to the 718 Spider, to the regular 718T. But more importantly, we drove some pretty spectacular classic cars that were put on a boat from Germany and floated across the ocean to get to Hawaii, where we were supposed to experience what those cars were like and compare them to their modern counterparts.
And on day one, we had some beautiful weather. I mean, it was crazy just how different that place is, which we're going to get into in a minute. But before we get into that, let's talk about press trips in general. For those who don't understand kind of the concept of how many of these work and how this Hawaii trip was nothing like many of those. When we go on a drive, like a manufacturer releases a new car, they typically invite many members of media, influencers,
athletes, whatever,
you know, high jumpers, skiers, whatever the program calls for, and they have them in different waves. So 3 days, couple spread out a couple weeks, and they get maximum amount of coverage on certain cars. So they fly you out to a location, put you in a hotel, and then they give you certain dinners or whatever to break it up, and then you work during the day to hear the presentations, learn about product, drive cars, and then at the end of it, you're supposed to release something to talk about that experience in those cars. And in this case, this is much different.
This is really more of a passion project for Porsche. It's something their classic car museum in their home base, Germany, is very proud of doing, and they do every 5 years. So we had the fortunate pleasure of being picked. And I think one of the things I want to talk about in this video, Mark, again, this is becoming a travel blog, but we always talk about how a lot of the soul for modern cars is going away. And a lot of that thrill or involvement's going away. I think about the Integra, right? We have this expectation that modern cars are going to have that visceral feeling from the 90s or early 2000s. But what Porsche showed us is you can drive a car from the 1950s or 60s or 70s or 80s or 90s like we did, and in some ways there is some lineage that at least modern Porsche products still manage to carry through. I know that sounds like marketing BS, but if you drive one of the new cars, like the Turbo or the Carrera S or the 718 Spider, there is still that level of specialness that exists behind the wheel of those cars. No, you don't feel everything like you used to.
Right, yeah.
But I think, I don't know, what were your takeaways? Because you weren't a Porsche person like me.
No, I came into it, I'm like, I'm in a exotic location for me. I've never been to Hawaii before. And it was, to me, the cars, like I saw them all lined up, and you know, obviously as this goes on, you're kind of going to see some pictures, more of like slideshow and some of the beautiful B-roll there. And I see the cars lined up and I'm like, kind of cool. But I was more interested in the landscape, the geography, like what it would be like to drive these cars through that environment. So to me, they were just cars. I didn't know the history. I didn't know why they were special. I didn't understand why people were like, oh my God, this thing is so amazing. And I think the only one that kind of caught my eye that it was really just so cool was the Speedster.
The one we drove was from 1956. The 356 is really the first mainstream or volume production Porsche car ever built. It was built or designed, or it was the brainchild of Ferry Porsche, Ferdinand Porsche's son, and it's why this brand exists today. He wanted to design a lightweight, maneuverable sports car. And if you think back to that era, all the cars back then were giant boats, at least here in the United States. Big V8s were 19 feet long, super heavy, non-maneuverable. And he took this relatively lightweight, or actually extraordinarily lightweight, 4-cylinder Boxster engine, put it in the rear like you get today, had torsion suspension, but what it felt was way ahead of its time. When you drive that car and you compare it to its let's call it relative competitors of the era, it felt like a rocket ship or a spaceship. It actually felt designed. You look at the interior, it's minimalistic. You have these little buckets that you and I barely fit in. A beautiful, simple metal dashboard with easy to read gauges, a great view out. And when you drove it, and we drove a lot of cars on this trip, it felt really, really special.
And I think I started by saying this, like I looked at these cars and, if you're a car person, you're going to find something to appreciate about this. And I think that's what really did it for me. I kind of was able to turn my brain off of where I was at, and I looked at this car as a whole. And as I said, I knew nothing about this car. What you just told me is more than what I know about it. So anybody that has gotten their hands on this or owns it, regardless of price, that's how special it is. It is an experience. And you feel like there was so much originality and thought given to every little nuance of it, and the character, the specialness. You can throw away speed and all the other stuff. There are absolutely almost no experiences like that in the modern age of cars or anything that I've ever driven. And the mechanics that Porsche brought from their museum that managed these cars, you could tell this was like a child. Like they're like, okay, be very delicate with it. Don't make fun of him. He's gonna have like they were
You'd have
so
a complex
they're
afterwards.
gonna get a complex. I mean, but that really, I understood why people were so excited about this car after spending, and I didn't even realize it at the time, and now I realize just how special it was to be behind the wheel of something like that. And it's a good point. Appreciate what you're doing when you're doing it, because when time moves on and you're like, oh man, maybe I should have been more in the moment. That's one of those times for me.
I think one of the things that I appreciated from just a technical perspective, right? You think of the story of that car. That body was not built by Porsche. It was built by a manufacturing partner, Reuter, who the car was built in Zuffenhausen, and Reuter was bought out, or at least their manufacturing capability was bought out by Porsche, and that company, what they retained, the rights to seats, and that company then became Recaro.
Oh, crazy.
The steering wheel in that car was a Nardi steering wheel, like an original Nardi steering wheel, and it was beautiful to use.
You mean it's not the same one off my Honda Civic?
Oh, yeah. I think one of my regrets, and put in perspective the trip, we had not done anything like this before, was to do a formal drive segment. I think that's one of my regrets for our viewing audience. But look at some of the footage. When you're behind the wheel, the little four-cylinder behind you, the 1600 cc's. I don't want to say it sounds agricultural, but you have this like rattly four-cylinder behind you. But it had actually like a musicality behind it that doesn't exist in modern cars. The steering, while it was very slow, the manual rack, you had a good idea of what the car was doing. The brakes weren't scary, and at 70 miles an hour or 65 miles an hour on the highway there, it felt normal.
And I expected, really, when I looked at it, I thought this was going to be like driving around my grandpa's old piano from the 1940s. It just looked like a wooden boat thing, and then you get in it and you realize, man, this is incredible. And you take into account steering slow. The diameter of the steering wheel is like 5 times bigger than and all the manual systems that are in it. But that's part of the charm. The engagement that you're feeling, the specialness that you're feeling is just. I don't know. I wish I could go back to that time and really kind of pick apart all these little things and experience it again.
It was special enough that the weather was piss poor while we were there. And we're going to talk about that a little later in this video again. But we were driving up past this volcano and it starts to rain. And normally you and I are like, oh crap. But it was fun. It was an enjoyable experience. It took you out of the relative tiredness and the misery. Like the weather is bad, it was windy, it was cold, it was raining, but you're in this little time capsule it's beautiful. That's
what cars do, and I think, if you're not a car person, you don't quite understand why people love this stuff. It's a money pit on wheels essentially, and if you don't have disposable income, a lot of this becomes unattainable for people. But to your point, 2 people like you and I driving in a beautiful setting, and weather was not good this whole trip for where we were at. It was a real disappointment, but that didn't matter, because in that moment of time, we were engrossed in that car, and it's a very rare place to be in life, and something that most people don't get to experience, and that's why it's special. Now, is it worth the money that it's going to cost to buy one of those? I don't know. You're going to need a lot of money to buy. How much are those things worth now?
I've heard everything from saying, I think Jerry Seinfeld bought one that was worth well over $500,000. I've seen them on BAT for less than that. I think here's my marketing takeaway to keep the folks at Porsche happy.
That's the best car ever. Every Porsche is the best car ever.
The modern, again, you drive that car, you think about that car was being designed in the late 40s and then was being manufactured throughout the 50s into the early 60s. It was so ahead of its time compared to many of its competitors, it felt modern. And if you get into the 911 Turbo S convertible, you drive that thing and you drive it compared to some of its other German or Japanese competitors, it feels like a spaceship in comparison. And I think that's, if there's any takeaway, not all of Porsche's history has been amazing, and we're going to talk about it more in this video, of certain vehicles that were disappointments, but now into the 50s, that star comparison, those cars are really amazing. We were on Kona, which is the big island, and it was...
The dry side.
Yeah, well, allegedly the dry side. Of course, when we went, if you were paying attention to the news, I guess last year, we went during the tropical storm that the governor called for a state of emergency.
Yeah, and I have the clipping from the news, and then there was a blizzard warning up in the higher elevations, and then literally we planned to talk about this much like what we're doing here, and we did record a segment where we're sitting at that little restaurant on the hotel site, and it is just a torrential downpour behind us for basically more than 60-70% of the time we were there. So even with that, even with the beauty of it, these cars were unique. I would say that, but I think really the best car there was the new 911 Turbo S. I mean, I just that car is, I don't care how
we were star looking or whatever, stargazing on one of the taller mountains on Kona.
Observatory.
The observatory, beautiful, beautiful location. And again, during most of these press events, what they try to do for those who aren't super nerdy or need to get every piece of footage possible, they break up the drive with activities.
Yes.
So you can go eat, you can listen to a presentation on the car, or they'll make fun things to do for you. So there was stargazing. He was burnt out.
Oh, yeah.
And we're driving down the mountain, and the road is extremely bumpy. If you've ever driven on Hawaii, the roads are, due to the way the earth moves underneath them, not the best kept in the world. And I'm flying down a mountain, and this guy's passed out. He's like...
And it was like, well, it was like late, too.
No,
wasn't it like midnight?
But that car's amazing. It's basically like a
like a Learjet, yeah. Seriously, like if you would have put me in one of the older cars and you were doing that, I would have been like, oh my God, when is this going to end? Like I had this sense of nervousness, but I literally passed out in a car that is like insanely fast. And that's what's so special about it. Yes, you can make the argument that it loses that connectivity, like you started to say at the beginning of it, but it makes up for it in its utter refinement, and utter speed and character and technical mastery, which of course we talk about in all these modern Porsche videos. That's why they're some of the best cars on the planet. But I think the other thing to talk about that was hyper important, even more so than the cars for me, was the way that they laid out this event, because it was special for me. What I'm going to take away more is we had these stops, and they planned this out with one of the locals who was multi-generational there. And he was essentially our tour guide. So they took us to kind of like a coffee plantation or a bean plantation. They showed us how to like roast beans, and then he would tell us about the history of each part of this island. And that was the whole point of these drive routes, is to touch each part of it and get a history lesson. And I found it far more fascinating than, because they didn't spend any time talking about the history of the cars at all. Porsche was really smart about that. They're like, okay, let's talk about the island where we're at. And I got a great history lesson that I had no idea about, which I should. And now I do, how horrible the white man is. I sat there and I'm like...
Our culture is very accepting of other people. And so we have a word that says aloha. And it means to exchange breath with one another. It also is the word for hello, goodbye, and I love you. And to me, that says a lot. If that's your I love you is also the way that you say hello. And so... we have a saying that says, aloha ke kahi I ke kahi, to love one another and to treat others with respect and treat others as the way you would like to be treated. And so when people come to visit, we always tell them that as long as you have respect for the land, then the land will respect you, and you have a great time being on Hawaii and on Hawaiian soil and in Hawaii. So, okay, some of the challenges that we face is, even language, just something as simple as language. It's something that was taken away from our culture many years ago, and it was actually against the law for people to speak Hawaiian. And so it came back in the 80s, and that's a challenge, just trying to get people to reprogram their brain to be able to speak our own native tongue. That's a challenge. Land is also an issue always, that we lost a lot of our land, and so as native people, we're forced to have to, how do you do your practices if you don't have a land base? And so the state agencies come in and they kind of take everything away so that you end up having to rent, or there's so many different challenges. But I think just having people love Hawaii and understand Hawaii and don't forget to go home is what we say. One of the challenges is that they all come here and then they stay here, and then everything goes skyrocketing high prices. And so we're like, come, we aloha you, have a good time, but don't forget to go home. Yeah.
It's crazy to understand the history and the trials and tribulations of what these people went through while we're driving around in hundreds $1,000 cars through this island in areas that people are not doing particularly well. And it's to me it was a sobering experience, really.
Well, so because you had that meaningful bit of conversation, I'm gonna hit you back with a car question.
Okay.
So we drove, again, basically an era of Porsche from every decade, right? We drove the 964, we drove a 944, we drove a 90s Boxster. At what point did the cars start to feel like the cars of today?
I'm thinking in my head what we even drove. Other than the Speedster and the 911 Turbo S, nothing particular was like stuck in my head.
The 944.
The 944 was cool because people, that
was the car from your youth.
Yeah, that was starting. That was popular, and it was cool to drive that for the first time, and that felt 90s. Like it had that connectivity. It still felt like I felt like it was a car developed to compete with like the 90s Japanese cars. To me, in my mind, that's how it reminded me of. And that was also the only car that they had to do some service on while we were there, which was kind of funny. But I felt bad for the mechanics because it was really late at night. We just got done driving. I'm like, oh, there's some smell. I don't know if we ran over something, but they did their due diligence and got it back on the road. But I would say the one car that stood out as being bad, like I'm like, get me out of this thing. It just did not age well. Was that lilac or purple? Which
it was a 964 Tiptronic 911 cab. And while that car to me in that color is good looking,
yeah,
the automatic does that car no favors.
Yeah, it's funny how that works. Like all the other cars mostly were manual. So you get into
at least the old cars.
Yeah, the old cars, and you get into like that middle generation auto car, and it's not just Porsche. Like and I joke around with you. People hated automatics. Like you had to have a manual. That's where this argument has come from. Is like people that loved manuals. Like there's no way you'd ever consider an automatic. And that automatic in that car, and I know Porsche will argue that it was still good for its era. You get out of that compared to the new automatics, you're like, oh man, I gotta have a manual. There's no other way to own that car. And it was cool to go back and just see the evolution of the cars. I think that was the biggest takeaway, other than like the history lesson of the island. And I don't know, man. I'm grateful to have these opportunities to do some of this stuff, even though it goes by so fast. You're on to the next thing and on to the next thing. You don't get a really good chance to appreciate some of the stuff that we do. And I know that's a common problem with human nature. Like people are constantly doing stuff and they're on to the next thing and they can't live in the moment. But some of this, being able to do these videos, is that way of kind of sharing that experience and reliving it and actually taking the time to think about it, because once it's gone, it's kind of gone. It's weird.
I think the people element is something that I will remember from that. Some of our favorite reps that we've ever dealt with are our friends at Porsche at this point. Frank, Luke, Shelby, Calvin. They're amazing people to work with, plus the German staff that came over with the museum cars. The gentleman in charge of the museum cars has a spectacular personal collection. And unlike us, right, Mark didn't grow up loving Porsches. I had the 996 Turbo on my wall, right? I love Porsche cars, but meeting someone who actually has worked for Porsche for a long time, understands these cars inside and out, and loves them to a degree that you don't see with many brands is very, very special. And they're highly knowledgeable and very nice people.
Yeah, I think that's the other part of it. It's the side of the cars, the people side of the island, the location, the history, the food, the culture. You're jamming in all this stuff in like 3 or 4 days. And then you really do have the people, and that's what I found doing some of this, is you start to appreciate the brands that have really good representation. And this is the inside baseball stuff of a lot of these discussions that we're having with cars, because I feel like certain brands that we deal with a lot, you can tell how a company's run by how their brand representatives deal with people like us, outside of the box, like off record, and how they treat and how engaged they are.
Porsche and a couple other brands out there are willing to spend hours with us on the phone, in person, and they really care about these products.
Yeah, and they may not tell us, and I know some of these reps that they do the work and they get the questions answered, and they go that extra mile because they see the value in some of the stuff we do. And I don't know in the back end if they just curse us or like get, it is more work. But bottom line is, like, if you're just somebody that shows up at an event, disappears, and releases a small article or a video and you never bother them, honestly, I know being on the other side of that stuff, sometimes you don't want to do anything. You just want to be done with this stuff.
You're burnt out.
You're burnt out. And I never get that sense from these guys that they feel that way. And that just, again, it goes to show, they like what they do. The brand represent all from the bottom to the top in terms of leadership. They care about what they do, and their products are, you see it in it.
Yeah. So with that, Mark, I think it's time for us to wrap up
All right.
our little travel vlog.